Did you know the Beatles were responsible for the first Apple Watch? You didn't? Well, you've come to the right place. Let's go. Ladies and gentlemen, look at this. One jewel, barely serviceable pin palette movement that is unpleasant to behold as it is to work on. I know what you're thinking. Why would a watchmaking god such as yourself lower themselves to work on this? There is a very simple answer to that. Every watch is a part of horological history, and this watch more than most. What am I talking about? I shall explain while we get this humble ticker to be the best it can be. We shall look at how this watch, clearly the first Apple Watch, has a direct link with the other Apple Watch that followed nearly 50 years later. How it epitomized a moment in the history of London and the nation, and why the enterprise this watch represented fails. But before we can do any of that, we need to get this non-running watch out of the case, and then hands and dial on. Polythene sheet to protect the dial from the hand levers. This dial is particularly delicate and by far the most important part of this watch. Look at that! This must be exactly how a painting restorer feels when they find a lost Picasso hidden under another painter's work. Two dials, both by Old England, yet very different. What is going on? The two dials on this watch provide a fine place to start the tale. Let's yacht while we continue the disassembly. In 1946, husband and wife team Asher and Rebecca Loftus established the watch brand Accurist, trading out of Clerkenwell, London. Using the time-tested method of putting solid mid-range Swiss movements in their own branded cases, Accurist's knack for promotion and advertising soon built a well-respected national brand. In the 1960s, Asher's brother, Richard Loftus, wanted to try a new market. Cheap, bright fashion watches to meet the new, bright styles of swinging London. Richard teamed up with watchmaker Claro to produce eye-catching watches to adorn the wrist of every hip young thing strolling around London's West End. Not wishing to dilute the stolid middle-class dependable image of Accurist, the company created the brand Old England. These watches were large and brash, accurate enough to not miss the last train home after a night out. These watches would be changed with the season, with this month's fashion, with an outfit. The traditional Accurist brand values of long-lasting, accurate watches didn't apply. We now think of Swatch as the pioneer of cheap, colourful, fun, fashion-led watches produced by a watch company rather than a fashion house. But Accurist were there first by nearly 20 years. What started as a range of cheap watches soon became a craze that spread well beyond the intended audience. Princess Anne, Elizabeth Taylor, Twiggy, and even the Beatles were seen wearing Old England wristwatches. Loftus and Accurist cultivated a relationship with the stars about town, so when the Beatles set out to create a London boutique with the stated aim to be a beautiful place where beautiful people can buy beautiful things, the groovy Old England brand was the natural choice to supply watches. Apple was already famous the world over as the Beatles' self-created record label. It was an obvious choice for the name of the store, too. To celebrate the boutique's opening, Loftus made the Apple Watch. Around 300 were produced, and they were only sold in the Apple Boutique on Baker Street. Some of the 300 also made their way to employees and friends of the Apple Record Company. When making these watches, Richard Loftus used a very flexible method of getting some Apple dials printed on card, finished with varnish, and then having them stuck to existing Old England watches he already had in stock. The opening of the store had some of the biggest stars of the time attending. The location didn't have a license to serve alcohol, so glasses of apple juice were provided to the guests, along with an apple to munch on. Television viewers across the nation watched as the coolest, hippest, and grooviest congregated at the shop's opening. The evening was hosted by John Lennon and George Harrison. Guests included Cilla Black, Alan Freeman, Eric Clapton, a host of Apple Records executives. Everybody who was somebody attended, even an old geezer in a hat. John and George did their absolute best to look like they were having a good time, but I suspect this wasn't the best party they'd been to that year. Even actual hippies, trying to turn the occasion into a happening, were struggling to inject excitement. But when it came to getting the shop on the map, the event was a huge success. Everybody knew it was the place to go. If you have a watch that needs servicing, repairing, or restoring, check out the Gentleman's Watch Services website linked in this video's description. We'll give your watch a huge hug and make everything better. And if your watch is particularly interesting, like this one, it could end up in a Gentleman's Watch Services video. No idea how that happened, bloody adverts they get everywhere. Please accept my apologies. Anyway, how's the disassembly going? All proceeding swimmingly. We'll plop this screw down here for the moment to compare it with its twin. Make sure they're the same. They are. So back to the Apple Boutique story, the most outstanding feature of the store was the artwork that dominated the street corner. It was created by the Fool, who were a Dutch design collective famous for their 1960s psychedelic art. They worked closely with the Beatles in London, painting George Harrison's, Minnie and John Lennon's Rolls-Royce. The 3-story high psychedelic mural on the outside of the Apple Boutique was their masterwork. The lack of an alcohol license wasn't the only paperwork missing at the store's opening. Planning permission for the arresting artwork adorning the outside of the boutique had also slipped through the crack. Westminster Council took an extremely dim view of this and demanded the artwork was painted over. In a move that foretold the Beatles' journey from Sgt. Pepper to the White Album, the storefront was repainted plain white with simple text label. Unfortunately, and perhaps not surprisingly, the Beatles' Apple Boutique was a commercial disaster, closing only 8 months after opening. While its grooviness was unparalleled, its stock control was non-existent, with more items leaving via the back door than passing through the cash tills. But just as the story of one Apple Watch was reaching its conclusion, another was at its very beginning. At the time this watch was leaving the Apple Boutique, a 12-year-old adopted boy living in San Francisco was taking his first steps to becoming a Beatles obsessive. An obsession that meant when looking for a name for his own fledgling company a few years later, rather than invent a name, he chose to take something created by another company and use it as his own. Apple Computers was born. Later, Beatles fan Steve Jobs claimed he chose the name because he was eating a lot of apples at the time. I'm not saying he was absolutely definitely being untruthful, but it was a useful story to have when being sued by Apple Records for trademark infringement. My word, that was quite the backstory, all encapsulated in this little watch. Amazing. Shall we take a moment to see how we're doing? We've completely disassembled the movement and cleaned everything. It's all looking minty fresh. We're also fitting a new mainspring. The old mainspring springiness had sprung many years ago. Then all we need to do is get everything back together in the right order. I do hope someone was taking notes. Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Close the lid, and that's step 1 complete. Next, we'll get the balance cock assembly back together. There's the cock, the cap jewel, and 2 ridiculously small screws involved. You have noticed that we call some plates holding parts bridges and others cocks. A bridge is supported at 2 or more positions and usually has 2 or more screws. A cock is attached to the body of the watch at one end, with the other end just hanging out there unsupported. We shall use cunning and physics to get the oil onto the cap jewel, first putting a small drop here and then poking a sharpened oiler into the pivot hole. Capillary action causes the oil to get drawn through onto the cap jewel. Let us reacquaint the balance wheel with its cock now, using a scalpel blade as a support as we pop the stud back in. And carefully close the boot to keep the hairspring captive for later regulation. For this cap jewel, we'll use a more direct lubrication method. I say jewel, it's actually a blob of hardened steel. This watch really does only have 1 jewel. We have to plonk this into place without disturbing the oil drop. Ready? 3, 2, 1, plonk. Some lubrication for the intermediate winding wheel, then we can fit the wheel and quickly follow with the winding bridge. Blue grease for the setting lever screw, then we'll hold the setting lever in position while we turn the screw from the other side. Barrel is next on the agenda, then we'll get the train of wheels into position. While we do that, let's talk a little about the history of this watch. This watch was given to a young Miss Grime who worked for Apple Records in their Savile Row headquarters. She gave it to her brother, who later passed it on to his grandson. You remember the Beatles' last performance together? On the roof. That was the building where Miss Grime worked. The concert lasted for 40 minutes before the police arrived and told them to turn down the volume. I wonder if Miss Grime popped up to the roof to watch. And what did they grow in that greenhouse? Tomatoes and whatnot, probably? The train of wheels are more or less in position, so we shall put a little dollop of grease on the barrel pivot. Then it's time to fit the combined barrel and train of wheels bridge. Some people start their watchmaking journey on these movements, assuming they're simpler to work on than refined, top-notch Swiss lever escapements, but nothing could be further from the truth. This is peak fiddly watchmaking right here. There's one way to do it quite quickly, though. Edit the video. Success, all pivots are in. Well done, me. Always a relief to get that first screw in. We are safe. The wheels are spinning. We can proceed. Crown wheel next. Notice how the crown wheel core is just part of the screw, and the click and click spring has been combined into one piece of metal. Clever simplification. The ratchet wheel has finally reached the top of the list. We'll take a moment to oil all the pivots now. I'll just show a couple, but you get the idea. We're over to the keyless and motion works, with blue grease on the winding pinion. And now the clutch. The stem also gets the blue grease treatment, just enough to provide a thin layer of lubrication. We're not basting a Christmas goose. Yoke and yoke spring, again combined into one part. Quick check that hand setting and winding positions on the stem are operating correctly. We're getting close now. And here it is, the pin palette that gives this movement its name. Quite fiddly to install due to the long pivots. Metal wheel on metal pins makes the lubrication of the escape wheel very important. We put the grease in the gullet of the wheel's teeth so it can be picked up by the pins. The moment of truth. Let's get the balance in and see how we have done. That is marvelous. Very gratifying. I'm sure Miss Grime would have been thrilled to see this watch back running. After some adjustment and regulation, we've got the movement back into the watch. Well done us. And here they are, 2 Apple Watches. One of these is still in support 57 years after it was made. One of these is a valued possession passed down generations, the other not so much. But the one thing they do have in common is neither would exist as we know them if 4 young scallywags from Liverpool hadn't decided to give music a bit of a go. Before we go, let's see how this watch is running. That's very good. Very, very good for a 1 jewel pin pallet movement. And only a few seconds deviation when we move to the vertical position. That is excellent. Right? That's it. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I did making it. And remember to stay groovy.